All right, welcome to another deep dive with a deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a really, really interesting thinker, Imre Lakatos. Have you heard of
Oh,
him?
absolutely. A fascinating figure.
Yeah, so born in Hungary, philosopher of math and science, really made a huge splash in British philosophy, especially after he had escaped Hungary back in '56, ended up becoming a professor at the LSE, London School of Economics.
Right.
Pretty impressive.
Absolutely. And his work, it really continues to spark debate, especially for folks like us, delving into these philosophical questions.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think especially for a philosopher, when you're really trying to get into the nitty-gritty of how knowledge actually grows and changes, especially in those fields that seem so like rigid, right?
Yeah.
Math and science. I mean, Lakatos, he just offers this really unique perspective, insightful, sometimes even a little provocative. And yeah, I know philosophy of science can feel dense at times, but what we're going to do today is sort of, I guess, extract the core of Lakatos' thought, the stuff that speaks directly to those philosophical issues that we're wrestling with.
Exactly. It's not about just listing facts or dates. No, it's about exploring what he really contributed, like his whole anti-formalist stance in math, really challenging stuff. And then, of course, his big one, the methodology of scientific research programs. We're going to call it MSRP for short, if that's all right with you.
Sure, MSRP it is.
Right. His attempt to kind of refine, some might even say completely change, how we see what makes science,
Yeah.
what sets it apart from other ways of knowing. Building on Karl Popper, too. Lots to unpack there.
Yeah, tons. And you know what makes Lakatos extra interesting?
Yeah.
To me, at least, it's it's his own story, his own life. It's like a tale of two Lakatoses,
Yeah.
You've got the hardcore Stalinist revolutionary back in Hungary, and then you have the staunch anti-Marxist, championing academic freedom in Britain. Talk about a change, right? And that gets us to a really fundamental question, right?
It really does.
How does this huge personal and philosophical shift, how does that impact his ideas? Does it subtly shape his entire philosophical project?
It's a question about the connection between a person's life and their work, isn't it?
Absolutely. And our sources, they make it clear. Lakatos, he was more than just like a philosopher's philosopher. His ideas, people are using them in all sorts of fields. Education, international relations, even like religious studies. All right, so let's get into this two Lakatoses thing.
Yeah.
What are the key things from his early life that clash so much with his later philosophy?
His early commitment, it's just so intense. In Hungary, young Lakatos, he was completely immersed in Stalinist ideology, and not just passively, like he was leading a communist cell.
Wow.
There's this really disturbing story, right? He basically convinced a comrade to commit suicide, all because of the party line, the demands of the ideology. Then he worked for the Ministry of Education, vetting teachers based on their political views. And then there's evidence that he was informing on people for the secret police. Heavy stuff. Now, try to square that with Lakatos in Britain, anti-Marxist, arguing passionately for intellectual freedom and open debate at the LSE.
Yeah, it's a complete 180, almost like a philosophy case study in itself.
Yeah.
Now, Lakatos, he's influenced by Popper, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he uses this distinction that Popper made between what Popper called World 3, the world of theories and arguments, and World 2, which is like the subjective world of personal beliefs and psychology and experience. So the initial instinct, and you see this in some approaches to the philosophy of science, is to focus on World 3 when judging a philosopher's work, right?
Absolutely. The idea being that the argument, the theory, it should stand on its own 2 feet, independent of, who came up with it and their personal baggage. But Lakatos, and he argued this really eloquently in his piece, The History of Science and its Rational Reconstructions, biographical stuff, he says it can actually shed light on the problem situation that a thinker was grappling with.
Yeah.
By getting the context, the intellectual and even social pressures they faced, we as philosophers, we can better understand what they were trying to do, right? What questions they were asking and why they approached them in that way.
And it's all about context.
Right. It is. He uses this great example of Descartes and his theory of vortices, right? And Descartes, everyone knew he couldn't outright contradict the church about the Earth's movement. That was a big no-no. So Lakatos says, look, this external constraint, it helps us make sense of some of Descartes' scientific choices.
So then, when we're thinking about Lakatos himself as philosophers, the big question becomes how much of his own intellectual journey, especially that total flip-flop on his ideology, how much of that was just like internal logic, pure reasoning driven by evidence and arguments, and how much needs an external explanation, like the psychological impact of what happened in Hungary, maybe even trauma, disillusionment, or the specific social and political context of his life, both in Hungary and in Britain.
It forces us to think about intellectual history itself and what it means to understand a philosopher. Can we really create a purely rational reconstruction of Lakatos's development? A clear path from A to B? Or do we have to dig into his past, his psychology, the social and political forces at play?
I mean, it really makes you consider those things, doesn't it?
It does. It reminds us, any philosopher looking at the history of ideas, we've got to remember, ideas don't just float in a vacuum, right? They come from people with lives experiences.
Right. Okay. So let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about another big area of Lakatos's work, something that should really intrigue any philosopher. His critique of formalism in mathematics. He laid this out most clearly in his work, Proofs and Refutations. It really challenges some deeply held assumptions about certainty in math.
Yeah, Proofs and Refutations. It's such a great read,
Yeah.
especially for philosophers, because it's written as a dialogue, a classroom discussion, and it takes on those dominant formalist philosophies of mathematics head on, not just, strict Hilbertian formalism, but logicism, intuitionism as well.
Yeah, he's taking on the whole establishment there.
He is. And Lakatos's point is that standard picture of mathematical development as this neat line of deductions from these set-in-stone axioms, it just doesn't match up with the reality of how math actually happens.
Yeah, and I mean, the way he paints it, math becomes way more dynamic. It's almost like organic. It's driven by conjecture, by finding those counterexamples, and then refining both the conjectures and even the very concepts involved. He brings up this idea of proof-generated concepts. The process of trying to prove something actually makes us understand the terms better.
Right, and it's like, can we even define these terms until we've gone through that process of proofs and refutations?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely that Hegelian flavor there, right? That thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing. You start with a conjecture, that's your thesis. Then the counterexample comes along, that's the antithesis. And from that clash, you get the synthesis, or revised conjecture, or new proof. It's so different from that static picture, the foundationalist view that formalists often present.
Exactly. Very different.
And the example he uses is just so brilliant. Euler's conjecture, right? For any polyhedron, the number of vertices minus the number of edges plus the number of faces always equals 2. So you've got your vertices, your edges, your faces. It's a beautiful formula.
Elegant.
Right. And then comes this killer counterexample, the hollow cube.
Oh, yes. The hollow cube.
Which seems to completely blow things up.
It does, doesn't it? Because with that inner and outer surface, you get a value of 4, not 2.
Right. So it seems like Euler's conjecture is toast. And in the dialogue, you've got this student, Gamma, who's very much the Popperian, right?
Right.
And Gamma's reaction is, well, that's it. Falsified. Done. Toss it out.
Standard falsificationism.
Yeah.
But the teacher in the dialogue, who represents Lakatos's own view, he says, hold on. Maybe it's more complicated.
And that's where things get interesting.
Yes, because he suggests we see proofs as thought experiments, not these guarantees of absolute truth. Even when they run into trouble, they can still lead to new insights, better concepts. He even uses the analogy of Columbus's voyage. Columbus set out to find India, but found America instead, didn't achieve the original goal, but discovered something huge nonetheless.
And this is where Lakatos gives us this really important distinction between different types of counterexamples, right?
Absolutely. He says there are those that are global but not local. So they challenge the overall conjecture, but not every step in the proof. Then there are the local but not global ones. These show a specific error in the proof, but might not affect the general idea. And then, of course, there are those that are both global and local. Each type provokes a different response, right? And pushes us to refine the conjectures and the proofs.
It's that back and forth, that dialectical unity of proofs and refutations, as he calls it, that drives progress in math.
Exactly. And this leads to what he calls concept stretching and proof-generated definitions, right? So we start with a basic idea of what, let's say, a polyhedron is. But then these counterexamples, like that pesky hollow cube, force us to rethink things. We try to salvage the proof, and in doing so, we end up with a clearer, more precise definition.
The meaning of the terms themselves evolves through this process of debate and refinement. It's fascinating. Now, this whole view, this fallibilist view of math, where even your rigorous proofs and basic concepts can be revised, it clashes with the formalist dream, right? That dream of absolute rock-solid certainty in math. The editors of Proofs and Refutations, they even point out how certain these rigorous proof procedures seem. But Lakatos, He's not letting anyone off the hook that easily. He seems to question even the axioms themselves.
Right, the bedrock.
Yeah. He's like, what if those initial assumptions could change? What if they need to be revised based on what we discover as we do more math? Then, anything built on those axioms, no matter how solid the logic, would also be potentially fallible.
Wow.
It's like realizing that the ground you're building on might be shifting sand. Makes you rethink everything, doesn't it?
It really does.
And this connects to Lakatos' idea of rationally reconstructed history. He says the real history of math, it's messy, right? Doesn't always follow a straight line. He calls it a caricature of a more ideal rational progression, driven by that logic of conjectures and refutations. This idea, that there's a rational story hidden beneath the surface of all those historical accidents. I think that resonates with a lot of philosophical approaches to history.
Yeah, that search for underlying patterns, for structure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's move on to what's probably Lakatos' most famous contribution to philosophy of science, right? His methodology of scientific research programs, the MSRP. His big attempt to give a more accurate and nuanced picture of scientific progress. He builds on Popper, but makes some pretty big changes too.
Right. Lakatos saw MSRP as kind of like Popper 2.0, Popper was focused on whether you can falsify a specific scientific theory. But Lakatos, he argued that we shouldn't focus on individual theories, but on these bigger things, research programs.
And what exactly is a research program? I mean, it sounds kind of grand.
Well, think of it as this ongoing sequence of theories, all linked together, sharing a common core. Lakatos calls this the hard core. It's the fundamental assumptions that, for the purposes of doing science within this program, you don't question. Think of it as untouchable, methodologically speaking.
Okay, so you've got this hardcore, these fundamental assumptions, but then what?
Then you have the protective belt. It surrounds the hardcore, and it's made up of auxiliary hypotheses, observational claims, experimental techniques, all the stuff that's open to testing and change when you run into problems.
So the hardcore is fixed, but the protective belt is flexible.
Right. And Lakatos says there are two big methodological heuristics that operate within these research programs. The negative heuristic, this one tells scientists, okay, if a prediction from your program turns out to be wrong, you direct the modus tollens. That's the logic of falsification at the protective belt, not at the hard core. You don't touch those core assumptions.
You tweak the edges, not the center.
Exactly. And then you've got the positive heuristic. This one's more forward-looking. It's a set of guidelines for how to develop and change those auxiliary hypotheses in the protective belt. It's like a roadmap for where to go next in your research, what problems are worth tackling.
Okay, I see. So it's not just about reacting to problems. It's also about proactively shaping the research program.
Absolutely. And Lakatos uses these great examples from history to show how the MSRP works, like the problem of Mercury's orbit in Newtonian mechanics. Or the fact that people couldn't detect stellar parallax at first, which seemed to contradict the whole Copernican model, right? In both cases, scientists, they didn't just junk the whole theory. They didn't say Newton was wrong or Copernicus was a fool. Instead, they tinkered with those auxiliary hypotheses, the protective belt.
Right. And that takes us to Lakatos' super important distinction between progressive and degenerating research programs.
Yes. Crucial distinction. A program is progressive if it keeps making new predictions, stuff that previous theories in the program didn't even hint at. That's theoretical progress. And then at least some of those predictions have to be confirmed. Empirical progress.
So it's got to be moving forward on both fronts.
Yeah.
Theory and evidence.
Exactly. If it's not doing that, then it's degenerating. Either it's not making new predictions, or the new ones keep getting shot down by the evidence. And Lakatos, he uses some classic examples here too, like how Newton predicted the return of Halley's Comet, or how Einstein predicted the bending of starlight during a solar eclipse. These were huge, novel predictions, and they were confirmed. And those programs, well, they were clearly progressive.
Okay, so what's an example of a degenerating research program, according to Lakatos?
Well, he was quite critical of Marxism, He argued that, at first, it did have theoretical progress, making those big predictions about capitalism, right? But then, empirically, it started to degenerate. Those predictions just didn't pan out. And instead of coming up with new, testable predictions, Marxists started making excuses, ad hoc explanations to try and save the theory. And that, for Lakatos, that's the sign of a program in trouble. He even suggested that you can rationally abandon a degenerating program, even if you don't have a better alternative yet.
That's interesting. It's like saying, okay, we're stuck in this dead end. Time to cut our losses and move on, even if we don't know where we're going next.
Exactly. Pretty bold claim, right?
Yeah.
Goes against that idea that you always need a better theory before ditching the old one. Lakatos is saying, no, sometimes a research program just runs out of steam. No more juice.
Fascinating. Okay, so for those of us who really geek out on philosophy of science, let's get into the nitty-gritty. How does Lakatos's MSRP actually differ from Popper's original ideas?
All right, let's break it down. So, first of all, Lakatos moves away from falsifiability as the one and only way to define science. In the MSRP, a whole research program can be scientific if it shows this pattern of progress, right? Even if some of the individual theories in the protective belt get falsified and replaced. And the flip side is true, too. A program could have theories that are technically falsifiable, but the whole thing's a mess. It's degenerating, not making good predictions. That's not science for Lakatos.
Okay, so it's more holistic, right? You're looking at the whole research program's overall trajectory, not just isolated theories. What else?
Well, Lakatos is also more forgiving about ad hoc changes to the protective belt.
Yeah.
Popper hated those, He thought they were just ways to dodge falsification.
Right, he was strict about that.
He was, but Lakatos, while he didn't completely unconstrained ad hocery, he said, come on, sometimes you got to adjust those auxiliary hypotheses. If you want to see a research program grow and overcome challenges, you got to give it some wiggle room.
Makes sense. What else?
This is a big one. Inconsistent theories. Popper, he famously said that a theory with contradictions is useless. It logically implies anything and everything, so it's worthless. But Lakatos, he points to examples like Bohr's early model of the atom. It had inconsistencies, but it was still a fruitful research program for a while, led to new discoveries, and eventually a more consistent model.
So Lakatos is saying, hold on, science isn't always this perfectly logical march forward.
Right. And this suggests that, at least implicitly, he was more open to pair consistency. This idea that you can have inconsistencies without the whole system blowing up. Now, Lakatos wasn't a dialetheist. He didn't believe in true contradictions. But he seems to say that science can work with inconsistency, at least sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's a big point for philosophers to grapple with. What role does inconsistency actually play in knowledge growth? Okay, what else is different between Popper and Lakatos?
This is key, I think. The whole line between science and non-science becomes a lot fuzzier in Lakatos. For Popper, it was clear-cut. Falsifiable, you're in. Not falsifiable, you're out. But for Lakatos, the status of a research program, it changes over time. It can go through phases, progress, stagnation, maybe even a comeback later on.
So it's not a fixed label. It's dynamic. It can evolve.
Exactly. Lakatos was all about that historical perspective, You can't just judge a scientific idea in isolation. You got to see how it develops, how it handles new challenges. Okay, now let's talk about this critique that Lakatos himself aimed at Popper. And it might even apply to his own MSRP, which is interesting.
Okay, hit me with it.
It's about the relationship between the method of science and the goal of science, and whether there's a hidden whiff of inductivism in there. So, in Lakatos' essay, Popper on Demarcation and Induction, he says there's a disconnect in Popper between the game of science, proposing bold, falsifiable theories and keeping the ones that survive testing, and the aim of science, which for Popper, especially later on, was getting to true theories, or at least getting closer and closer to truth.
Okay, so there's the process of doing science, and then there's this ultimate goal of truth.
Yeah.
And Lakatos is saying Popper doesn't quite connect them.
Right. Lakatos argues that Popper never really explains why playing this game of science, even if you're super successful at it, why that should actually lead to true descriptions of the world. You could have a theory that's highly falsifiable, that passes tons of tests, but it might still be false. It might not accurately represent reality.
Yeah, I see that. So what did Lakatos propose?
Well, he kind of teased Popper about it, saying he needed a whiff of inductivism, some principle that would link all those successful predictions to a higher probability of truth. Something that would say, okay, if a theory makes lots of good predictions, it's more likely to be true.
And of course, the irony is Lakatos might need that whiff himself.
Exactly. Because his MSRP faces the same issue, right? His game is all about building those progressive research programs, making and confirming novel predictions. His aim, like Popper, is also truth. But the MSRP doesn't inherently guarantee that progress equals truth. A program could make tons of good predictions but still miss the mark, It might not capture the deep reality of things.
It's like Lakatos calls out this potential problem in Popper, and then his own system might have the same problem, kind of a self-inflicted wound there. And it's also interesting to think about this in light of his strong rejection of inductivism when he was talking about the foundations of math.
Right. It's like, where does Lakatos stand on induction? Is he for it, against it?
It's a bit of a puzzle. And because of this, people have interpreted Lakatos' views on truth in different ways. Ian Hacking, for example, he had this Hegelian reading, saying that Lakatos wasn't that interested in truth, that he saw methodological progress as a kind of stand-in for truth.
Pragmatic progress, not truth itself.
Yeah, but when you really dig into Lakatos' writings, it doesn't quite fit. He was clearly on board with the correspondence theory of truth. He believed that truth was the goal of science. So while the method is super important, it seems like he still believed in truth as this ultimate epistemic goal.
Right. He doesn't abandon truth. Okay, one last thing we should cover. The big showdown that was supposed to happen between Lakatos and Paul Feyerabend, the Battle of the Titans, as it was called, and Feyerabend's accusation that Lakatos, Mr. Methodology himself, was actually a closet anarchist.
Yeah, that's juicy. I mean, Feyerabend, he was all about anything goes in science. No rules, just do whatever works. How did he see Lakatos as an anarchist?
Well, Feyerabend argued that any strict method, even Lakatos' MSRP, it would stifle creativity in science. It would exclude valuable research that doesn't fit the mold. He would point to Galileo, Galileo broke all the rules, and that's how he made his discoveries.
Right, so Feyerabend's saying sometimes you got to break the rules to make real progress.
Yeah.
What was Lakatos' response to that?
Well, Feyerabend posed a tricky dilemma, right? He said, look, if you apply the MSRP too strictly, if you say any research program that's degenerating should be abandoned, then you risk throwing away good science. What if a program has a rough patch, but then it recovers? What if it makes a comeback? It's kind of like Lakatos' own critique of Popper being too quick to dismiss theories.
Ah, so it's a double-edged sword. Too strict, and you might miss out on future breakthroughs.
Right. So what did Lakatos say? Well, he made this distinction between judging theories and advising scientists. He said, look, the MSRP, it's for evaluating how science has developed historically, for understanding why some programs succeeded and others failed. It's not a rule book for scientists.
It's a tool for analysis, not a set of instructions.
Exactly. The MSRP can tell you if a program is in trouble, but it doesn't say, stop all research right now.
Okay, I see. But Feyerabend, he wasn't buying it. He said, a demarcation criterion that doesn't tell scientists what to do, it's basically useless. Yeah. It's like having a system for judging art, but not giving artists any tips on how to create good art. If it doesn't guide action, then what's the point?
And here's the thing. Lakatos, he saw the problem, but he died before he could really formulate a full response. Their letters back and forth, they show that Lakatos knew Feyerabend's critique was serious, but we never got that knockout punch from Lakatos.
So the debate's still open then?
It is, and it highlights this ongoing tension in Lakatos' work, this attempt to have a rational system for understanding science, while acknowledging that actual science is often messy, unpredictable.
Right. Okay, so wrapping things up, we've gone through a lot here. We've looked at Lakatos' ideas about how math grows and changes, his concept of proofs and refutations, his methodology of scientific research programs with all its moving parts, the hardcore protective belt, progressive versus degenerating. And when we talked about his relationship with Popper and those tricky questions about induction and the goal of science, it's a lot to digest.
It is. And thinking back to that idea of the two Lakatoses, his own life, that incredible transformation he went through, it really helps us understand what drove his philosophy. He was grappling with these huge questions about rationality, about progress, about the tension between sticking to your guns and being open to radical change.
Yeah. And for philosophers today, Lakatos' work is still a goldmine. It pushes us to think critically about how knowledge grows, about how we judge theories, about the relationship between history and philosophy.
And this brings us to a final provocative thought. Lakatos emphasized progress, right? And he said that even degenerating research programs could make a comeback. So how does this apply to philosophy itself? Could we say that philosophy goes through phases of progress and degeneration, just like science? Something to ponder, wouldn't you say?
It really is. Food for thought. All right, well, that's another Deep Dive completed. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. See you next time.
See ya.